Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, just a little announcement. My wife has launched a brand new video on her channel. It's really good. Her channel is all about the environment. If you didn't know already, I actually have a tiny feature if you want a face reveal, but it is a really good video. She put a lot of work into it, and it would mean a lot to me if you guys would watch it. Of course, you don't have to. The link is in the description and at the end of the video if you are curious. Thanks guys. But anyway, for now, it's time to get ready. Get your raincoat on and brace yourself for the storm and let the darkness take control. I used to work for the DNC in Yosemite National Park, and I lived with my boyfriend at the time in one of the employee tent cabins by the stables. They don't like to put non-stable employees over there because the trees aren't maintained like they are in Huff or Boys Town, and it's just a much smaller area. But we complained so much about the constant partying in Huff that they stuck us over there in Tent 13B. 13B was a rebuild of Tent 13, which had been crushed by a tree the year before. My boss at the lodge told me this story about him being one of the first responders out there when it happened. During the evening, a ton of snow fell, piling up several feet in just an hour or two. Then during the night, the temperature raised, and all the snow began to melt. Which doesn't sound like a problem, except that all the snow weighing down on the branches of these huge trees starts cascading down and bringing other, larger branches with it. Sometimes the weight will bring the entire tree down, since root systems are shallow. The kid who lived in Tent 13 was sleeping during all of this, and one of these weighted trees fell, crushing part of the employee kitchen, bathroom, and finally across the middle of his body as he was laying in bed. My boss told me that when they came to the scene, his body was purple and his eyes had popped out of their sockets. It cut him in half, effectively. That scene really haunted me, especially knowing we lived in the same spot. The kid was only 27 at the time, which was the age I am now. He hated working for the DNC, like me, and he was slated to leave the park for the high country the very next day. On Christmas Eve, we were all packed up to leave the park the next day for good, since we had both quit the job. That evening, a ton of snow dumped into the valley. Several feet of snow accumulated in just an hour or two. Then at night, it warmed up, and branches started falling. My boyfriend had drank himself into a coma, and even slapping him in the face had no effect. Tent cabins are made of canvas, and you can't see out, so the sound of huge branches breaking off all around is extra terrifying. It sounded like actual bombs going off, hitting our roof and other cabins. If you've never heard a tree breaking and falling, don't worry, it's unmistakable. I didn't feel like going into the employee kitchen would be safer, since it had been crushed last year too. So I just laid in bed listening all night. At one point right behind the tent, I heard a tree break at the base. I braced myself for the end, and I could hear it was about to fall. And then with this huge thud, it fell right behind our tent and ended up destroying one of the stable fences. Obviously we were okay, but I have never been more scared in my life. It was a night of absolute horror, and knowing there was nothing more I could do about it. Yosemite is a powerful, wonderful place, but I'm glad that I don't live there anymore. My dad and I had been hiking out in Colorado, and on this day we were doing the Shavano Tabiguache pair, which to anyone accustomed to climbing 14ers know isn't very difficult, just a fun day hike. As the sun came up, we noticed it was completely cloud covered, but figured they'd all burn off in a few hours. As the day goes on, we summit both peaks and are coming back to Shavano completely engulfed in the sheet of clouds. Visibility was a good 10 feet max. Now I say the difficulty isn't bad, but as we're making our way down Shavano, back to the tree line, we ended up coming down the opposite side of the mountain. Now we make it down about 2,000 feet before we notice something's wrong. Just then, the clouds decide it was time to start pouring on us, with the fog only getting worse. As we come down further, the incline starts getting relatively steep, and we decide the best move is to turn around and go back up the saddle and cross back into the valley we came up on, which is a very stupid decision. We make it about 1,000 feet back up, and we still can't see the top anywhere in sight, and the several ton boulders we've been climbing up are hella slick and are starting to shift with all the rain. Still pouring, I finally decide it's time to try and call search and rescue. After spending 30 minutes trying to get a signal, we manage to get a hold of them, and they say that all that we can do is go all the way down to the valley and hike through the woods for several miles until we run into the Colorado Trail. They had no way of reaching us. At this point I tell my dad, at least there's no lightning. And just like that, a few hundred feet away strikes the first bolt, and from then on, we're in a full-on thunderstorm, 1,500 feet above the tree line on the side of the mountain. So we freak the hell out and start running down the mountain, not caring about slipping or falling. We manage to make it down to Shavano Lake without making any more than a few scrapes and bruises, and we think, hell yeah, we did it. It was just a quick walk in the woods back to camp. And I'm not going to go much more into detail, but the woods we ended up walking in were another 5 hours in the pouring rain / near freezing. I'll never forget how good the shower felt that night. The calm before the storm is real. One time that will stick with me is when I was fishing with my dad. It was a pretty rubbish day, and after a while we could see some pretty mean looking storm clouds off in the distance. All of a sudden everything got quiet. No more birds, no more wind. It was extreme quiet. The lake surface was smooth, and we stopped drifting. We continued to fish for a few minutes when my dad froze and said, "Hey, do you hear that?" I stopped moving and listened. I did hear something. A faint rustling sound that was slowly growing in volume. My dad, as he is quite the outdoorsman, and has most likely experienced this before, pointed to the far shore and said, "It's the wind." I looked in the direction he pointed, and I could see the wind. Or more, I could see the effects. A line of disturbed water was moving towards us from the shore, and everything behind it was being whipped around. Trees would get hit by the line and all of a sudden look as if they were in a storm. The rustling grew in intensity as the line approached us. Still utterly calm where we were, my dad and I watched. This line of chaos raced towards us, and when it hit, it was night and day. A wall of air slammed into us, causing us to physically recoil, and we were instantly in a storm. At least no rain was present yet. The wind howling around our ears made the low rustling sound immediately transform into a harsh, continuous blast. Communication went from quiet voices to yelling towards each other. My dad yelled to me that we were leaving before it got any worse, and so we hightailed it off to the lake as it began to turn into angry seas. Fun times. This is probably close to 10 years back. Myself and my mother were visiting her sister in the north of the country, a few hundred miles from where we lived. We had left with the intention of spending a long weekend. My aunt and her family lived close to a road unofficially called the Murder Hole. This was the name given to it by locals, as it was a frequent haunt for highwaymen. Their house was really nice, but it was literally in the middle of nowhere, at least a mile from the next house, and miles away from the nearest town or shop. As we got close to my aunt's, a huge summer storm hit. Torrential rain, thunder, and lightning. The house was undergoing massive interior renovation at the time, which meant my mum and I would be spending the night crashing in the living room, as all the spare bedrooms were out of commission. The storm was so bad, the workmen actually delayed leaving until it calmed down enough for them to brave the roads. When they did leave, we spent most of the evening on the back porch, watching the storm before we turned in for the night. I crashed on the couch, while my mum took a leather divan-type sofa that was placed directly under the window that faced the driveway. Late into the night, I woke up feeling very uneasy, as if I were being watched. I opened my eyes but didn't get up. I remember a weird sensation creeping up my neck. I turned my head towards where my mum was sleeping and felt my blood chill. A black figure stood at the window, his hands up to the glass, as if he was trying to see if anyone or anything was in the room. If it wasn't for the window, he would have been able to reach out to my mum. The driveway had a very powerful light fixed on a pole at the edge of the front yard. My mum, exhausted from all the driving, was completely out, despite the figure being no more than 18 inches from her face. The figure continued to slowly scan the room, then stopped suddenly, as if he had just seen me. No light was cast into the house, so the room was completely pitch black. The storm had gotten worse, and thunder and lightning were striking frequently, as if, on cue, a lightning strike hit and lit up the inside of the living room for the briefest moment. The figure left his vantage point and started walking towards the right-hand side of the house, where there was another window, offering another view of the living room. I waited until the figure was out of sight and slid off the couch, scuttling into the doorway just off the living room and out of the view of the second window. I peeked from behind the wall and can see the figure at the second window. By this stage, I was freaked and unsure of what to do. Lightning hit again, and the figure's head snapped right to where I was hiding. I remember being almost frozen, feeling his eyes were locked onto me, even though I couldn't see them. He left the second window and headed back towards the first. I somehow managed to move, running to the stairway in the corner of the room that led up to the bedroom of Mum's aunt. I burst in and shouted that there was a man outside looking in. Once over the initial surprise of me waking them up in such a panic, the husband, a large man in his own right, jumped up, summoned his two eldest sons who were a couple of years older than me, found two cricket bats, and marched down the stairs. The rest of the family and myself followed warily. My mother, having been woken up by the commotion, met us at the bottom of the stairs, having just been passed in the hallway by her sister's half-naked husband, trotting a cricket bat and marching out into the storm. I explained what happened, but could tell my mother was equally part skeptical as she was shocked. We waited for what seemed like an eternity, in the darkness, as no one thought, or perhaps dared, to turn on a light. Mum's friend tried to reassure us that it was just a late-night traveller who had broken down or perhaps gotten lost. Her husband and son returned after a minute or two. The husband went as far as to get changed and check the grounds before he hopped into his car and drove the road a few miles in both directions. There was nothing. There had been no sound of a car leaving the driveway or any physical evidence of anyone being outside. This did little to reassure me, as I was unable to shake the feeling of being watched that had originally woken me. We barely managed a night's sleep before we gathered our things to set out the next morning. My mother was convinced I had imagined the whole thing and told her sister so by way of apology. This annoyed me at first, although I knew it was the most logical explanation for them, as no one else had seen the figure. Looking to forget the whole experience, I did not argue the matter. Mum went to the car wanting to get an early start on our plans for the day. I quickly popped my head into the house to say my own goodbyes and apologized for waking them up last night. Our car horn sounded, and my aunt's husband remarked my mum was getting impatient, which was unlike her. I shrugged it off, but the car horn kept blaring, with 2 long continuous beeps, and a third final one which was a bit shorter. I went to the side of the house where the car was parked. It hadn't moved, and sat with all the doors closed apart from the passenger door on the driver's side, which was wide open. It was as I got closer to the car that I saw my mum, slumped over the steering wheel. Frantically, I pulled open the door and tried to shake her awake. I found the pulse on her neck, which seemed strong, but she seemed to be completely unconscious. I pulled her out of the car and shouted for help as I carried her to the house. I set her on the same couch I slept on the night before, and with some help of her friend, tried to bring her around from what we assumed was a random fainting spell. Thankfully, she revived quite quickly, and was quite embarrassed by the fuss she felt she had caused. She didn't remember passing out, or even getting in the car. We also found her watch had somehow frozen at roughly the same time that she got into the car, and it started working again later that day. When I was living in San Francisco, I sailed in a beer can league every Wednesday. Generally, the conditions are not so bad, and if it is, we can reduce the sail area, which is called reefing. Anyway, one evening we were faced with winds of around 25 knots, gusting up to 30. Honestly, this should have probably cancelled the race, but it was near the end of the season and people were starting to get pretty competitive. Fast forward to the race. We have rounded the furthest buoy and are heading backwards towards the finish line, when we see that another of the boats has gotten their shroud hung up on a buoy. Another boat was already rendering assistance, so we go and finish the race without incident. As we are motoring around the harbour, having our last post-cruise beer, the Coast Guard shows up with a helicopter and powerboat, sirens blazing. The boat launches and they go out to rescue the stranded racers. As people start to trickle into the clubhouse, we learned what happened. Apparently the skipper was cutting it close to the buoy like we did, right when a gust hit him. The shrouds were caught on the buoy, which ended up pulling the mast down, killing one of his crew and breaking the neck of another. The skipper walked away unscathed. There were only a few boats in our fleet, and we were all pretty close. I knew every person in the league by name. I lived off the base of Pikes Peak in Colorado Springs, and during the spring and summer, I spent a lot of time in the mountains. By far the scariest thing that has ever happened to me in those mountains was an hour-long lightning storm that ended up putting me and two of my buddies in quite a bit of danger. 5 of us came up together in a Jeep Wrangler and a Hummer, and while on our way, we got a phone call from someone saying they would meet us. Great. Directions to the spot are given, as well as directions to a go-to spot that was very easy to find off a main road before it got woody, in case they could not find our camping spot. After a certain amount of time would pass, one of us would leave for the go-to spot and guide the third car back. This is sometimes how we go about things to plan around loss of cell service. Well, enough time passed for 2 of us to hop into the Hummer and go find our other friend. This left 3 of us to hang out, which was no problem until the storm hit. If you've never been on the Front Range of Colorado during hail season, then you won't understand how very devastating and quick a storm can form, and oddly enough break up and then calm. Seemingly out of nowhere, a light drizzle, which quickly turned to heavy rain, and then marble-sized hail. Just as quickly as the storm hit us, we realized our biggest problem. The Jeep only had 2 seats, and it's filled up with camping supplies, a very nice telescope, and other odds and ends. There was no room for 3 people. Period. It was unspoken that we should not leave someone outside in the hail, nor would just one of us go into the Jeep. We were in this. Getting obliterated by rain and annoyed by some decent hail, the electricity started flying. We were in a canyon, so thunder was rolling and echoing, and sounding as if Zeus had just found out I just gave Calliope a poke and never returned her call. The noise was terrifying. We found a blue tarp in the back of the Jeep, and were just able to tie it to a few trees to at least shelter us from the rain. But it was one particular bolt of lightning that changed my respect for the power of the Rockies. About 50 feet from where we were hurtled was a fence that outlined the property of a very large ranch. You couldn't see the ranch by any means, but the fence was clear as day, as well as a large pillar that stuck from the ground with a sign that said, "Warning, trespassers may be shot," or something similar bolted to it. While we were waiting for the storm to pass, and all the while among dozens of very loud and bright clashes of thunder and lightning, a massive bolt bends around the mountain, of which's base we were against, and strikes onto this post, absolutely frying it. It was as if the bolt clung to the post for a solid 2 to 3 seconds. Needless to say, we were horrified, because this was considerably less than 100 feet away, and this bolt was huge. The most disturbing part of it was for about 10 seconds after the bolt had gone away, that trespassing sign was glowing molten red and vibrated so loudly that we could hear it over the rest of the storm. Our friends in the Hummer returned perhaps 45 minutes after this, and by then, the sky was clear, and it wasn't 75 degrees again. My parents' house got hit by a tornado when I was in high school. You don't realize how fast those things happen until you've been in that situation. We live in rural North Carolina. Not exactly Tornado Alley, but we do get some bad storms now and again. My dad had this habit of liking to sit out and watch thunderstorms come in. We were all inside where we hear him yelling for us to come out. We'd walk out and the sky would just look surreal. There were all kinds of black clouds sweeping towards our house at a disturbingly fast pace. When I say black, I don't mean really dark grey or steely blue. I mean black. Jet black clouds. Like an ink cloud from a giant octopus that squirted into the sky. I've never seen it before in my life, not even on a video, and hope to never see it again. So we were pretty freaked out by the clouds, and the wind was picking up. I mean, those clouds were moving fast. Someone, I think it was my mum, said something to the effect that maybe we should get inside just to be safe. But things started going crazy even before we could turn around. The wind goes from a 7 out of 10 on the windy scale to a 25 in about 3 seconds flat. We turned to the inside, and I'm the last to go through the door. I try to pull it closed behind me, but the wind is sucking the door open. I have to pull with both hands on the knob and jerk back with my full weight to get the door shut. At this point, it's been about 45 seconds since our dad originally called us outside. We run to the hallway and start throwing things out of the closets under the stairs and climbing in. The whole house is full of this absolutely indescribable roaring noise. It was like a jet was taking off on our roof, or a train was driving through the living room. It wasn't so much sound as a physical force. It made your head throb. It was so loud. You could feel it constantly in the pit of your stomach, like the boom from a loud bass speaker. But instead of having a beat, it was just constant. It felt like your eyeballs were quivering in your head. The pressure changes from the wind also screwed with your sense of balance. I kept getting the sense of vertigo that you feel when standing on top of a cliff looking down. It was an absolute sensory overload. We all jump under the stairs and shut the door when we realize we had left the dog out in the house. My mum opens the door and yells for the dog, which comes barreling into the closet like a bat out of hell. We shut the door, and at this point it's been maybe a minute and a half. Just 90 seconds, since we were sitting in the kitchen chatting, and my dad yelled at us to come outside and look at these crazy clouds. That's how long it took to go from a normal evening to an absolute horror. We sat under the stairs for maybe that much time again. 2 minutes pass, possibly 3 at most. It seemed like longer, of course, and everything was shaking. I was just waiting for the walls to tear apart around us, or debris to start smashing through the floor. Then the sound passed, and we came out. The house was still standing around us. So far, so good. We go back out on the front porch and the door won't open. I give it a heave and push it open, and squeeze out. The porch is destroyed. We had a small barn sitting in front of our house, and it had been obliterated. The tornado had picked up the barn, turned it into kindling, and threw it at our house. The posts on the front porch were all destroyed, and it was just covered with broken glass, nails, shattered 2x4s, and pieces of particle board. Looking out over our pasture in front of the house, where we kept a horse and some cows, and there were just masses of trees down everywhere. One strand of pines in the south of our house, and probably about 2 or 3 acres of trees in total were just gone. Our cars were pockmarked with hail damage. One full-size pontoon boat that we used for family trips to the lake on weekends had been picked up from the front yard, rotated 90 degrees, and deposited in the backyard about 50 yards away. Behind our house, a massive poplar tree was down over the driveway, and it had fallen just feet from the house. Yet, other things remained weirdly untouched. One of our barns was destroyed, but the other, standing maybe 30 yards away, wasn't missing a shingle. All in all, we were incredibly lucky. The house sustained major damage. Despite its appearance, though, the roof had to be replaced because the suction from the tornado had made it unstable. In fact, to this day, you can still see cracks in the walls and the corners of the top floor where the tornado had nearly sucked the roof off the house. But we came out, none of us hurt, and even slept in our own beds that night. So when I see stories like that out of Oklahoma a while ago, I always think back to those few minutes of horror, and how lucky I was that those weren't my last moments, as they were for so many others. About a year ago, my cousin and I, who were both 19 at the time, decided to go sailing on a pretty windy day, with about 7 Beaufort and a 1.5 to 2 meter high wave on the North Sea on the Dutch coast. Now, the boat we sailed on was our own, a Dart 18 catamaran, and was over 30 years old. With that age, things break quite easily and often, so we went through the first row of waves, no problems at all, and went about 10 kilometers off the coast. The wind was coming from the east, meaning that we had to zigzag back to the coast, as no boat can sail into the wind. So about a quarter of the way back, suddenly both of our rudders broke, and we had nothing to communicate with. This meant that we had to steer using our sail to get back. That, on its own, is not a very big problem. What is, though, is that with a catamaran it's very difficult to turn when facing the wind. It also means that big waves for an only 18-foot sailboat, plus no rudders, plus a hard wind blowing us away from the coast, meant that we were very much sitting there in the sea, thinking that we had no way of getting back. Luckily, we had previous experience with steering with sails only, as we learnt to do that for fun, and we remembered that we could use the high waves to gain extra speed when going down from the wave. So we used that in order to zigzag back. We capsized around 5 times, which was extremely exhausting, especially with those fairly strong winds. It took until about 2 a.m. to get to the coast, and we landed about 10 kilometers from the club from where the boat had its place. This happened to my dad about 10 years ago. He was out gardening, and a storm picked up incredibly quickly. He looked up when he heard a sharp noise and a crack. The wind was picking up and felling trees in the forest behind our house. The wind, though, thanks to his fence, which was rather tall, was only skipping over the top of him, and he wasn't really affected yet. So, ignoring it, he tried to be as productive as possible, as he was tending to his garden. Without really realizing it, the wind picked up, and before he knew it, he was in a full-blown storm. He knew at this point he had to go back in, and our garden is very long, so it would be about a 2-minute walk before he'd reach the door. He got up and started to make his way back, when he heard a crack. He turned around to look behind, and a tree was falling directly to him. Fortunately for him, he was only hit by the very top. It did knock him over, and he got a gnarly cut on his head. But had he not noticed sooner, or been just a few steps back, it's likely that he would have been hit by a far heavier part, and that could have been the end of my dad. We're very grateful it wasn't the case. Moral of the story, kids: don't stay out during a storm. This happened in Iraq in 2018. It was a very stormy day, and you could say thunder and sandstorm covered the whole sky, making it an orange color. The wind was so strong, making the doors open and close, making the wind slam roughly without stopping, making the windows slam roughly without stopping. And there was this howling sound, like screams and roars. I was alone in my house. My family were all at my grandfather's to visit. I was playing some games and trying to ignore the weather, and the sound was just getting stronger. It was creeping me out. After an hour of playing games, I heard someone knock at the door. I looked out the window towards the street and saw that no one was there. I thought it was the wind, so I ignored the sound and resumed what I was doing. But the knocking persisted. I returned to the door to see who it was. But before I even said who's there, I waited a moment, and there was a response saying in an old tune, "I'm an old man. Can you let me in your house? I can't stand in such weather. I just can't handle it." After that, I opened the door. His whole appearance was strange and very odd. He put his long white beard, and he wore very old clothes and a black and grey turban. He was putting some small cloth in his mouth as a mask to protect himself from the sandstorm. His right eye was so white, it looked like snow. He was a tall man, however his right hand was extremely dark, and he was wearing some strange rings that I have never seen before. And he had black fingers with 2 rings on each. It was very strange. He sits in the chair, and I look at him and say, "Do you need something, sir? Perhaps water or tea?" He looked at me with a smile. "That would be really helpful. Bring me some." I get him what he asked for, and he thanked me for the drink. And after about 2 hours, we spoke normally. I asked him who he was and why he was wearing such odd clothes, and about his dark hand, and he looked at me and smiled. "Since you are very kind with me, I will give you 2 gifts. One is to answer your question, and the other gift will be a sight and what will happen in the future." I looked at him, quite confused and curious. I wasn't sure about what he was saying. He told me that he was a sage, a hermit, a magician, a sorcerer, that he's many things and travelled from many parts of the Middle East, and he's seen many things. He said that his dark hand was one of the steps to becoming a magician, and it was to get struck by thunder or lightning in his hand, so he must put the hand on fire for a full day and then on water for 3 days, and in doing so gain control of the elements. About these strange-looking rings, he said each ring was a jinn, and inside they work as his servants. He asked if I wanted to know what would happen in the future. I looked at him and said yes. He told me that I would be moving to another country for a year, then one of my family members would die peacefully, and told me that the Middle East would have some problems, but it would be fixed years later, and told me that Europe and America will have disasters, especially America, concerning ice and fire. After telling me all of this, he began to walk to the exit door and began to leave, and told me that he would be back next year at the same time on the same day, thanked me for everything, and was gone. After that, everything he said came true. My grandmother died in the hospital. She was in a coma and her brain stopped. She was dead, the doctors say, and that she died without any pain. She looked so peaceful. And looking at the Middle East, there are problems. Hopefully, they'll be fixed soon. And America had very low temperatures which made it very cold, and almost freezing winds, as well as there being the Chicago forest fires. It seems like everything he said was coming true. I'm waiting to see if he'll return this year, and which omens he predicts for the future. I went cruising around in Hurricane Sandy. I enjoy going out in bad weather for some reason, as it's a cheap thrill. But I saw the number of trees down and leaves everywhere. It quickly went from this is cool to holy crap, it's a really dumb decision and I could die. I drove 20 minutes to find my friend's house at 3 or 4 a.m, only to turn around when her mother wouldn't let her out the house. I drove around in the next hurricane too. My friend's girlfriend and I went to get cigarettes, and while I was creeping down a road with my head out the window looking at a fallen tree, a downed power line smacked right off the windshield in front of my face. I saw it out the corner of my eye at the last second, as this dark shape rushing at my face, and I let out a little scream that I claimed was fully masculine, and she claims was the scream of a little girl. I also tried walking to a gas station for fun in the middle of a 36-inch blizzard in 2013. I made it about 60 yards, before I imagined getting stuck and killed by a plow, and turned around. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. First time doing storm stories. I've done stories in the rain before, so stuff that happened when it was raining, but this one was a bit different. And it really did humble me a little bit. Storms can be scary and powerful. Thankfully in England, the weather is pretty docile. You don't get extreme weather like you do in most places, at least not very regularly. Although yesterday there was very high winds, and a tree did fall down in front of our apartment. It's funny because I was bringing Pandora back home. She was having a little nap, and all the trees were fine. My wife arrived not 2 minutes later and said, "Did you see the tree that had fallen down?" I do wonder if I'd have been just a little bit later, if that could have fallen on me. That's not an exaggeration, that's true. But thankfully it didn't and I didn't even notice. But damn, it can just happen like that. So be careful out there guys. Don't go out during storms and high winds if you can avoid it. All that it takes is one tree, and bush, it's the end. Like that poor camper fellow who almost left his job. What a poor guy. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video and aren't horribly depressed by that, feel free to drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for new videos every night. Oh, and it would mean a lot to me if you would click the link on screen very soon to watch my wife's latest video. It's about the environment, it's about going plastic free, which you know is very important and people should try and do. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. It means a lot to me if you click that link. Either way, no hard feelings. And I'll see you in the next one.